Okay, how's that?
Yeah, there we go.
I can leave at any time. It won't
Okay.
worry me. Anyways, um, San Francisco was my hometown and still is, of course. Doesn't look quite like this at the moment, but I was born in the Sunset District near Lake Merced and educated at St. Gabriel's School and St. Ignatius High School. And I attended the College of Marin for a while and then went on to UC Berkeley. And as far as knowing where I am now, this is a map of Australia, of course, and you can see Sydney down here, Melbourne to the south. Canberra is sort of equidistant between Sydney. Canberra is the national capital. Brisbane is to the north, and I'm up here in the rainforest, just about 24 kilometers inland from Cairns, which is Cairns is a popular tourist, or was a popular tourist area. Because of COVID, there aren't any international flights coming in there now, so it's a bit on the dead side. For your information, just north of Rockhampton here, the Tropic of Capricorn comes through. So if you go around to your part of the world, the Tropic of Cancer comes through at around Acapulco. So from there north, as you get closer to the equator, it's considered tropical. And this is a look at my garden with a fairly diverse flora and fauna. And this is one of our garden birds.
Oh,
The southern cassowary. You can see that it's a formidable creature weighing about 60 or 70 kilos, a fairly decent sized bird. And when they're around, we just carefully go in the house and let them do their thing and they move on. But I diverge, I'll come back to them later. This is a look at sort of where I used to live. This is Sunset Boulevard in 1931 in San Francisco. If you look along, you can see Golden Gate Park there, and there's just vaguely, you can just vaguely see the Straits and Marin County on the other side. I grew up about 11 blocks behind where this photograph was taken. And in the early days, this is the L streetcar on Taravell Street at 40th, there were lots of sand dunes. And so when I grew up, it wasn't quite as barren as this, but there were plenty of sand dunes around. And my grandmother was a nature lover and got me started with a butterfly net when I was about 6. And the sand dunes around Sunset Boulevard had plenty of native insects. And we had a vacation house at Rio Neto on the Russian River. And so I spent the summers up there looking for insects. The sand dunes around where I live, this is about 1910, but in the 40s, there were plenty of sand dunes with native vegetation. And I used to set out molasses bait traps with Dixie cups, and you could get overnight a few specimens of the Pacific sand treader cricket, Rhacognimus velitas, but they're probably not even there anymore, maybe just in the dunes behind the beach, if at all. But fortunately, the species has a fairly decent distribution from Point Conception north to Point Reyes. So it's not extinct, but it's probably not very common in San Francisco anymore. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the importance of the California Academy of Sciences to me and to people like Katie Tauber, who's in the audience, and about, dozens of other people. The Academy had a full department that they called the student section. Originally, it was called the Junior Academy, but it was changed in the 50s to the student section. And it consisted of a series of rooms, a library, cubicles dedicated to biological or geological topics. Everything was covered from entomology to botany, ichthyology, even astronomy. And the student section was staffed by 2 senior people in the academy, or biology teachers from around San Francisco. Any high school student in San Francisco with an interest in science could join. And this is the new academy as it was under construction here about 15 years ago, and the opening day there, and it's got a rainforest, and probably many of you have been there to visit. The student section was open after school and on Saturdays, and formal meetings were held on Tuesday nights at the academy. And these consisted of a talk given by a professional or a member of the public, or even the students at times. On alternate Saturdays, the student section rooms were open for students to visit and talk with others with similar interests and work on their collection or refer to books in the library. And on the other Saturdays, local field trips were taken. The academy had a vehicle that was designated for use by the student section, and about 6 to 8 students plus the driver could be accommodated. We visited sites on the peninsula, in Marin County, in the East Bay, and on long weekends or during Christmas and Easter breaks, we took camping trips to the mountains or the desert. It was absolutely fantastic. And here's a trip that we did in the late 1950s to Anza Borrego, and you can see Katie Tauber standing there, and Martin McGrath and Javier Penalosa and Ed Kirschbaum. Friendships were made that lasted to this day, and I'm in contact with at least 6 people that I met during that time in the student section. Here's Chris Wemmer, who went on to become a mammologist at the Smithsonian, standing in front of the giant Ocotillo. Chris is still with us. Let's hope that the Ocotillo is too. Who knows? But what was the point of this? It was more than just a fun time for kids after school. The academy encouraged both the research staff and the students to get together and know one another. Students were welcome to visit the research department, and liaisons that would last a lifetime were developed. Almost all of the students went on to become professionals in the sciences. In my case, the entomology department became mentors. And here we see Hugh Leach, who was a curator of the beetle section, Don McNeil, and Ed Ross. He's kneeling down collecting embeids in the Grampian Mountains in Australia when he came here some years ago. And here I am with Paul Arnaud in Chihuahua, Mexico in 1960. We took a joint trip with the Ross family and went down the west coast of Mexico and up through Chihuahua for about 5 weeks, a wonderful opportunity. Other mentors included Ashley Gurney from the USDA at the Smithsonian, and of course, my major professor, Woodrow Middlecoff. I was a student at Berkeley following a stint at the College of Marin, and by the way, congratulations to Paul De Silva on his recent election to the board of the College of Marin, a wonderful accomplishment. I spent 10 years at UC Berkeley, and following that went on to the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia, now called the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University. Following that, a 3-year stint at the Academy in San Francisco, followed by an interview with Doug Waterhouse, Chief of the Division of Entomology of CSIRO at the Academy, and I was hired by CSIRO, but stayed in San Francisco for an additional year to fulfill work on an NSF grant. At Philadelphia, this is the Academy of Natural Sciences. That's my office up on top with the lights on. The entomology department occupied at the time. almost the entire top floor at the academy. So I went to work in Canberra, which is down here in the southern portion of the continent, at where most of CSIRO is a large organization with more than 30 divisions, covering everything from things like entomology to meteorology. The collections, the insect collections, are housed presently in this building, which was under construction in the 80s, the D.F. Waterhouse Laboratory of Insect Taxonomy. The collection is now housed in 2 buildings, and there's a new site with construction about to begin on another building where they'll move the entire collection. The collections are housed in compactus units. The curator's offices are to the left. And I understand there won't be offices for curators, but they'll be using the range concept in the future. The collection houses about 15 million insects. And this is the fellow I replaced, Ken Key, when he retired. He was working on orthopteroids. He worked on locusts for many years. And he's holding a steel drawer with the insects in it. And all the drawers in the ANIC are steel, and they're heavy. And I asked, why the hell steel? And he said that in the early days, they couldn't really get a guarantee on the quality of timber for drawers. So instead of having that problem, they decided to go for steel, and steel drawers are what they have. You can imagine the weight of the collection. Anyways, my job description was that Doug Waterhouse said that Ken had worked on the acrodoids for about 30 years. I should pursue the other half of the Orthoptera, the Entomology, the crickets, katydids, and other groups. And he told me, we'll give you the tools to do the job. And I always remembered that. That's a tremendous thing to say. We had top flight facilities, the best microscopes, and great technical assistance. And shortly after I was hired, they hired John Lawrence to look after the beetles. Even though the ANIC was a large collection, after a few trips, I discovered that the fauna was much bigger than I originally thought. I thought there could be about 1,000 species of katydids in Australia, but that's a conservative estimate. And there may be twice that number. But there are other surprises awaiting as I took the job. The Kalula monster, Kalula propator, is a very odd insect built for tunneling through the sand in north central coastal Queensland. Shortly after I started, I received a box with a specimen on a pin, and I thought it was somebody playing a trick. Aussies are great for having you on, so to speak. I thought they had glued several parts of several insects to one another and created this creature, but it turned out it was the genuine article. It's a cricket about the size of a Jerusalem cricket, but it has almost none of the features that you'd expect. It's got antennae with about 9 or 10 segments. It's got tarsi that are longer than the adjacent tibiae. And it's got, this is a male. Males are short-winged, females are wingless. Males can run around on the surface of the ground. Females are virtually immobile on the surface of the ground. They're built for digging. So there are little tractors that must be in the ground. And the peculiar thing about the Kalula monsters is that they have a very odd mouth part and digestive system. I'll show you that in a minute. It was so unusual that I felt that it was worth a new family, so we christened the Colulidae. And eventually DNA suggests that it's a aberrant member of the Anostomatidae. These are what we call in Australia king crickets. There aren't any in the US, as far as I know. Looking at a Colula monster head on, this is not the mandible, as you might expect. It's an enlarged Licinia. The mandible is very small and positioned behind the Licinia. And these creatures are predators, and I think they probably use the Licinia to sort of slash into things like cicada nymphs and beetle grubs that they feed on. This is a grillocritid that you might think looks like, it may look a bit like a Colula monster, but it differs in almost all the other anatomical features. Presently, we have about 8 to 10 species from various localities around north central Queensland. The original one came from around here. This is Fraser Island, which is in the news at the moment because some idiot let a campfire get out of control and part of the island is burning. So anyways, that'll change the habitat for a while, but there are a number of species from these different sites. All live in the ground. The males may be terrestrial, adult males may be terrestrials, and they may shelter in leaf litter. We just don't know that much about them. Males have been collected on rainy nights. So fishermen sitting in their tents wondering about when it's going to stop raining have picked up 2 or 3 adult males that have wandered in. Otherwise, you have to spend some time digging for these creatures. Chris Muller, who works on conservation projects, uncovered many of these monsters with his backhoe during some of his excavation work, and he's collected a number of them in a couple of different localities in North Queensland. I don't know if Daryl Gwynn is in the audience today, but one morning in Western Australia, he and I observed these large buprestids, Julidomorpha bakewelli, attempting to copulate with discarded stubbies. Stubby is an Australian term for a small beer bottle. And this one was especially attractive. And there's a cast-off body of another beetle here. And you can see there are ants dragging this poor guy down, and they'll dismember him and take him away. The bottle is filled with sand. So what was the attractive mechanism here? Well, it couldn't be that there was some beer left in the bottle. Australians would never do that. But it seems that they were attracted to the color and these little pimples, which are on the base of the bottle and serve as a grip for people that are drinking the beer. Anyways, the observations were published in the Journal of the Australian Entomological Society in a 1-page note. And this apparently was the most important research we had ever done, because to this day, we get questions about the observation when we've been on numerous talkback radio programs. It seems like it goes through phases. There'll be a bit of a lull, and then somebody will discover this and they'll come back for an interview. In 2011, Daryl Gwynn and I got the Ig Nobel Award in biology for this. And of course, we went to Harvard and accepted it and gave our 1-minute talk. One of the wonderful aspects about Australia is the bush. You can get to natural sites within a short time, even from big cities. And the ANIC had a fleet of vehicles and caravans that were frequently used. every 2 years or so, we took a major trip of about a month or even longer to some far-flung part of the country that hadn't been surveyed much. Participants stayed for about 3 weeks and oftentimes were replaced by other colleagues who flew in and took over and eventually returned home. So the opportunities were great, not only for collecting, but for studying the biology of insects. We had caravans, land cruisers, and these, we had a fleet of these Toyota Hiace vans, which were not extremely powerful, but they served as good camping vehicles for 90% of the time. And we had units that you could purchase, put on top. You have an excess room there and a bit of a place to sleep, and you could work inside at microscopes. Perfect. So with this land of diverse habitats, and most of the country with unpredictable rainfall, the coastal areas are much greener than the internal part of the country. And you can see most of the population is scattered along the coast, and the inside of Australia is well, it's pretty well unoccupied. And if they could figure out how to get water there, they'd be there too. In Western Australia, this area is undergoing severe changes due to agriculture, mainly for growing wheat. And down in the southern part of Australia and around Canberra too, there are large expanses of vineyards. And I just hope that the Chinese will learn how to grow grapes, because when they plant vineyards, it's quite different from cattle grazing. With vineyards, almost all of the native vegetation is removed, and the area is sprayed for weeds and stuff. With cattle grazing or sheep grazing, something is left, but with vineyards, there's nothing. So the more of the habitat that undergoes agriculture due to grapes and vineyards and stuff, the less chance you have of discovering what used to be there. This shows a bit of the Australian habitat. This is North Queensland here. Along the coast, we have rainforests. It's not very rainy here at the moment, but it will be. The rainy season will start in less than a month. Inland, you have eucalyptus, about 600 species, acacia, about 800 species, lots of grasses and other shrubs. And you can see, for an entomologist, these areas are absolutely wonderful. This is the coastal sand plain in Western Australia. There's a variety of heath vegetation, and during certain years when they've had adequate rainfall, the wildflowers are terrific and they attract a lot of people. But at the moment, these areas are pristine areas for agriculture, wheat growing and other agriculture, grazing and vineyards, of course. But I must get to the katydids. My main research group is the Tetagoneidae. I've been working on them for most of my lifetime. This example is a genus that was unknown until we described it, Armadillo grigia, the armadillo katydid. This is a male, and it's got wings underneath there, which it uses to produce a sound. There are about 3 or 4 species in Western Australia. So my research started with generic revisions, and 3 volumes of a monograph have been published. I reckon it'll take oh, many more volumes to cover the whole fauna. This is an example, volume 2, which included 3 endemic subfamilies. And volume 3, which includes another couple of endemic subfamilies and a big one, the Listrosolidae, a group of predatory katydids that is very diverse in Australia. Just to show you some examples, this is Microtetragonia tachys. It measures about 7 millimeters, 7 or 8 millimeters in length, a mini katydid. And this is Tympanophora, a endemic subfamily with species, one genus with species in Eastern Australia, one species along the coast, and in Western Australia, in that heath zone I mentioned, there are many species. Males are fully winged, females are wingless, and it's a predatory katydid. It feeds on other insects. And you can see this is an adult male of Microtetragonia tachys on an Australian 2-cent coin. So one of the things I noticed was that there are an awful lot of tiny species in Australia and many katydid groups. And I think it's because with the unpredictable rainfall, the weird climate, once they get a good year, these things, the eggs hatch and they mature quite quickly, probably in a smaller number of molts than would be the case in temperate areas. So this little katydid is found in heathy areas during certain favorable years. And this other creature here, which I have in my garden, it's called the Australian palm katydid. It's in a genus that's fairly well developed to the north in New Guinea and the Pacific Islands, but it was undescribed in Australia, and it feeds only on palm. It's about 70 millimeters long. It's facultatively parthenogenetic, and I have it in my garden. This is a phaneropterine katydid, a female, wingless. The male is fully winged. It has the same color patterns, but they're hidden under the tegmina. And when this thing is disturbed, it raises its tegmina and reflex bleeds and displays the orange neck membrane. And probably the blood is toxic. I don't know of anyone that's analyzed it, but that would be a good project for someone to see. It feeds on certain plants that are strong in alkaloids, so perhaps maybe it's a real toxic creature. Another endemic subfamily is this. This is a katydid. It looks like a stick insect. It's a wingless katydid with prognathous mouthparts, feeds only on flowers, and there's one genus in the subfamily from the coastal Western Australia. It's in heathy areas, and you can see it doesn't have very dilated hind femora, but if you take it off its plants and put it on the ground, it hops just like any normal katydid would. The other subfamily is this one, the Zaprochilinae, which comprises 4 genera, most of them in Western Australia in this heath area. This one is along the southern coast, Windbailey of Viridae. By the way, you have to watch out when you're collecting. There are other primitive things running around. This is Zaprochilus, the genus Zaprochilus with its prognathous mouthparts, built for dipping into flowers and sipping the nectar and the pollen. And the largest one of the group, which is about 60 millimeters long, Anthophiloptera dryas, the balsam beast, which was discovered in gardens in North Sydney by Dempsey Klein, and she worked out the biology, and we described this together some years ago. It's got a very, very broad range from where I am here, south to Sydney, in wet habitats where it feeds on flowers. Most of these critters in the Zaprocylinae are winter and early spring katydids. So this little fellow is in a genus with about 20 species, Choanophila. Males are very short-winged. This is one singing at night. In midwinter in Western Australia, the females are wingless and they're on flowers and they feed on pollen and nectar. And the average collector that would be out in wintertime collecting and would sweep one of these things up would think it was a nymph of something else and throw it out. So we had to go to many localities looking for these things, and we got about a couple of dozen species. And moving on to guidebooks, in retirement, living about 3,000 or 1,800 miles from Canberra up here, I thought I could give back some knowledge in the form that others could use in the form of guidebooks. CSIRO was publishing a series of guidebooks, and I did one on katydids, and you could use color photographs, which was terrific as far as I was concerned. One on cockroaches that Martin just showed you a little bit earlier. And I must say a word about cockroaches. You might know the Australian pop group, the Cockroaches. If not, you certainly know who they morphed into. They became the Wiggles, which is one of the most popular children's groups. It's on every TV station probably. And they're almost the same individuals that were singing with the Cockroaches all those years ago. Australia seems to have the largest diversity of cockroaches per unit area of any place in the world. Right here where I'm sitting on my property, I've recorded 95 species, and only one of them is of any domestic concern. Well, you've got to watch out when you're collecting cockroaches. Here are 3 species from my place. You can see this one is just about 3 or 4 millimeters long, the genus Mediastinia. This is the genus Johnrenia, of which there are lots of undescribed species. And this one, it was number 94. It's a genus and species that is yet to be described. And I must say a word about the crickets. We did Yuning and I did a book on crickets, which came out a year or so ago, and the crickets are just as diverse here. We based it on a monograph that Dan Oddie and Dick Alexander did on Australian crickets in the 1980s, and we figure there may be upwards to about 1,000 species of crickets here. They're everywhere. To conclude, Australia suffers from many of the same problems that exist around the world, mainly due to overpopulation. Arable lands are being cleared. You can see this wonderful vegetation of native plants and eucalyptus and shrubs and all cleared for agriculture, mainly wheat in South and Western Australia. In this case, in New South Wales, at least they've left the hillside, probably because they couldn't really flatten it out for wheat growing, but they've left some of the trees. And if you were to snuffle around in there, you'd find many of the original species that used to be there before agriculture. The problem is if they spray, the drift would get into there and would affect the local fauna. When I came to Australia in the 70s, this was a common scene. I was told these trees have been ring barked. If you look at the base of each one of them, you can see that they've been ring barked. And there was a profession of people called ringers. And if you were a landowner, you might call up the troop of ringers and tell them you had 20 acres that you wanted ringed, and they'd come out with their sharpened axes and ring bark these trees and kill them. Then you could, eventually grasses would grow up and you could graze in there. By doing this, instead of felling them, they didn't have to clear. The branches just fell out gradually, and eventually the trees would drop over, but by that time the termites would have cleaned them up. So you don't see ring barking so much anymore. They just use tractors. And the other thing is suburbia. This is in Western Australia, north of Perth. Suburbia is moving into the sand plain. And in this case, a fire has gone through. Fire is a natural part of many Australian habitats, but a natural part, not set. And when suburbia moves in, they just usually knock off the larger trees, and of course you get gladiolus and other imported plants moving onto the landscape, and it makes it pretty miserable. Anyways, that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, we can unmute the microphone. I have a blog spot which you can Google Bunyip Co, and you can get onto that. And I've got a Flickr site which is for some reason called Nature Noises, and it's got hundreds of photographs from all around Australia arranged in albums. And I just want to thank the Western Neighborhoods Project for use of the vintage San Francisco photos. So,
Yay, that was great.
Great, wonderful.
Well done. Good to hear your voice again.
Bravo.
Greetings from Arizona.
thanks so much. And screen. Trying to get to any questions from anyone? It's good to see Katie and Warren and Dave and all sorts of other folks that I know.
I keep hearing up there.
Clapping.
Hey, Dave, I have a question.
Okay, fire away. Hi, Kip.
Hey, how's it going? I was wondering about the biogeographic connections of the katydids in Northern Australia. What are they related to stuff in New Guinea, or do you have an idea?
No, and it depends on where you are. In where I am, there are certain groups that are related, but many, if not most of them, are just autochthonous. They're related just to Australian stuff. And there's been some input from New Guinea, but we have katydids. So there are several genera, believe it or not, that are in the same tribe as Naduba, which you have in California. They don't really look like them until you do some analysis, but they're in the same tribe. So you've got an autochthonous fauna, and you've got input from some of the northern, but not a lot from New Guinea. Not a lot from New Guinea. With the cockroaches, most of the cockroaches are not really closely related to anything else other than themselves. They're wholly Australia, and extremely diverse. So, I mean, you can take any genus of Australian cockroach and create a PhD thesis project. We just saw one this morning that puts down its egg case in the crack of the piece of bark, and then chews bits and pieces of bark and covers it up, plasters it in place there. Really quite remarkable. And others like that small 2 or 3 millimeter one that I showed earlier is they're very flattened and they exist in unfurling leaves. So they're suited for that lifestyle, and they're not related to anything else.
Dave, I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
The predaceous katydids,
Yeah.
what do they feed on, and what do their earlier stages, the young nymphs, what do they feed on?
Well, there's one group of katydids that, believe it or not, hexacentrus feed on other katydids.
Huh.
So they are in the same habitat as a number of these leafy green katydids, and that's what if you see them feeding on anything, that's what you see them feeding on. But the other ones, there are some that are omnivorous. They feed on caterpillars and spiders, other small insects. And this group of katydids that are related to Naduba, they seem to feed on grasses and grass seeds.
Okay.
So they're not predaceous at all.
Yeah, and the younger stages, the young nymphs, are they predaceous too?
Well, they would eat a fair amount of floral bits and pieces.
Yeah, okay,
Predaceous as they grow up.
okay, interesting.
Nice to see you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder about any kind of different colors in the katydids. And also I want to know, you were talking about the tiny ones, but how big would they get?
Some of the smallest ones are about 5 or 6 millimeters long in the male. Females can be a couple of millimeters longer than that. And there's a whole group of them that are that would be certainly under a centimeter in length. There are several genera of many species that are small like that.
But how big could they get?
Oh, the largest one, the largest katydid in Australia is that palm katydid, and that's about 75 to 80 millimeters long as an adult. So you've got everything in between.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Actually, I have a question, Dave. If you think about Western Australia, you were mentioning the area around Perth.
Yep.
And that's been compared a lot to parts of California. If you look at the katydid fauna there, it's probably much richer than in California, right? So then is there something missing that we have in California that's not there, and the katydids have radiated to fill those niches?
That's a good question. I think there are more different subfamilies represented in Western Australia than in Western North America. Those 3 or 4 are found only in Australia. So they've been here for a long time and speciated, of course. And a lot of them are highly specialized, some feed only on fruits of shrubs, and others on grass seeds. And there's a few that are predaceous, but you have a lot of specialization in the Australian katydids. And with these flower and nectar feeders, there's nothing like them anyplace else that I know of. that have prognathous mouthparts with special grooves in the mandibles that I think conduct the nectar from the flowers that they are feeding on.
And then my wife has, thanks so much for that. That's amazing. My wife has a question about their sounds. Anything? What do they sound like?
Well, they sound like everything. I've made over 2,000 sound recordings of Australian,
Wow.
most of them katydids. And katydids sing with high frequency sounds. And as you get to the ancient age that I am, you can barely hear them, if at all. So you have to use a mini bat detector to discover whether there's any singing where you are, and then use your recorder to make recordings. And in the last several years, I haven't been doing too many sound recordings because I've been doing other things, but except for the Phasmodes, the males of all the species produce sounds, and the females of some species also produce sounds. So you've got to include that as far as your taxonomy is concerned when you can do it. And we're looking at things like the stridulatory files now with electron microscopes so we can see similarities and differences. So, we're using DNA to some extent, and I've been working with Nori Ueshima for about 50 years on karyotypes, and Dave Weissman has been doing that as well. So we're still in contact with Nori. We look after his health, and we whenever we ask a question, we always get an answer.
Marvelous to hear that he's well.
He was a graduate student when I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley.
Mhm.
So I was back some years.
Yeah, I overlapped with him too, Dave.
Very good. Yeah. Nori's a living treasure.
Well, just one more thing, Dave. I'm very glad to hear that you made it clear that we did not grow up in the sunset when it looked like that. We came a few years later. Thank you.
It's wonderful to see how it had been, and we have memories of those sand dunes where Giannini High School is now, and around where I used to live, where I remember in March you'd get Bibio albipennis, the bibionid fly, out in some numbers in the sand dunes, and you just wonder whether it's there anymore at all. But
Yes,
anyway.
but our streets were paved and we did have houses.
Well, thank you so much. Let's everyone thank Dave again for his wonderful talk.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave. Well done. Again, good seeing you. Yeah.
Nice to see you too, Warren. Wonderful habitat.
You're welcome here.
Okay, I might take you up on that sometime.
Sure, marvelous.
Lynn Lowe wants to be unmuted.
Oh,
Is she unmuted?
you can unmute yourself, I think.
Oh,
Who is it?
Lynn Lowe, my colleague from Darwin.
Okay.
And I'm trying to unmute her. She's there. I think she's unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can, Dave, yes.
How are you doing? How are things in Darwin?
I'm noticing a distinct lack of fauna up this way. It's been very hot and sticky, and so everybody's camping overnight and not coming out there during the day to be seen.
That's what everyone says,
Mm.
not only in Darwin, but around here. And Jack Hazenpush says the same thing down south.
Wow.
Thing around.
Hey, Dave,
Yeah.
I just went through our Ring of Steel into the countryside out of Melbourne last week. And the main thing I saw in northern Victoria were lots of plague locusts. There haven't been
Oh,
plague locusts in Australia in numbers since about 2011, but they're building up apparently, and that would be quite a fitting end to the year, wouldn't it, to have a locust plague?
wow.
It could provide jobs for entomologists.
Wow.
Well, I will say it's a pleasure to be sitting in on a PCES meeting again after all these years.
Yes, well, I think the last one, well, before the one before this one, 50 years since I went to a PCES meeting.
Wow. Neat. That's so cool.
Remember the days of standing in the Morrison Auditorium and standing at the podium. Those days are gone.
Good old.
Well, yeah, that is a silver lining of the COVID situation of having the meetings online, is that people can join from many different locations. So we're getting to see people from all over the world. So thank
We
you.
found that to be the case. We had the American Archaeological Society meetings postponed and held back in June. And I think we had twice the number of attendees as we have members.
Wow.
It was, yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful medium.
Yep, it is. And it'll all disappear as it is doing, because in this part of Australia, believe it or not, in Queensland, we haven't had a COVID case in 2 or 3 months. And in Cairns, we haven't had one for longer than that. And as the New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory come back online, the Zoom meetings are disappearing. So
Really?
yeah, so we're happy to have been able to have this chance to see everyone, and I guess eventually it'll be business as usual.
Yes, I would love for our United States to have low COVID cases too.
Oh,
Let's keep that in our intentions and our actions to have that. Oh,
Just wear a mask.
yeah. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Our next meeting is going to be in December, so keep an eye out for the announcement for that. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to add?
I missed the refreshments and cookies in the conference room. We don't have those.
Yes, happy Thanksgiving and Merry Christmas if you can.
Yeah, same to you.
Yeah, thanks. You too.
Good night, everyone.
Good
Okay.
night.
Take care, Chris.
bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good to see you all.
See you tomorrow.
Take care.
Be safe.
Yeah. And Vince, sorry I didn't get to see your face, but
All the best. Cheers.
It's hairy.
yeah, my COVID beard.
COVID beer.
Right. Man, huh?
Or my mandibular scapula.
All right.
All right, you all take care.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
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 Bye.